ओम नमो भगवते वासुदेवाय। ओम नमो भगवते वासुदेवाय। Unit 4 Performance of Contract Learning Outcomes. After studying this chapter, you will be able to understand how obligations under a contract must be carried out by the parties, various modes of performance, consequence of refusal of performance or refusal to accept performance by either of the parties, rights of joint promises, liabilities of joint promisors, and rules regarding appropriation of payments. Unit overview. Performance of contract. By whom? Liability of joint promisor and promisee. Rights of joint promisees. Time and place of performance of promise. Performance of reciprocal promises. Agreement to do impossible acts. Appropriation of payments. Contracts which need not be performed. Discharge of a contract. The unit explains who must perform his obligation, what should be the mode of performance, and what should be the consequences of non-performance. Performance Performance of contract. Meaning. Performance of contract means fulfillment of obligations to the contract according to section 37. The parties to a contract must either perform or offer to perform their respective promises unless such performance is dispensed with or excused under the provisions of the Contract Act or of any other law. Types. On the basis of section 37, performance of contract may be actual or attempted. Actual performance, where a party to a contract has done what he had undertaken to do, or either of the parties has fulfilled their obligations under the contract within the time and in the manner prescribed. Example: X borrows 5 lakh rupees from Y with a promise to be paid after 1 month. X repays the amount on the due date. This is actual performance. Offer to perform or attempted performance or tender of performance. It may happen sometimes when the performance becomes due. The promisor offers to perform his obligation, but the promisee refuses to accept the performance. Example: A promises to deliver certain goods to B. A takes the goods to the appointed place during business hours, but B refuses to take the delivery of goods. This is an attempted performance. The promiser has done what he was required to do under the contract. Conditions to be satisfied. Conditions to be satisfied for a valid tender or attempted performance. It must be unconditional. Example: A offers to B to repay only the principal amount of the loan. This is not a valid tender since the whole amount of principal and interest is not offered. It must be made at proper time and place. Example: if the promisor wants to deliver the goods at 2 a.m. This is not a valid tender unless it was so agreed. Reasonable opportunity to examine goods. Example: A contracts to deliver B at his warehouse 1000 kgs of wheat on certain date. A must bring the wheat to B's warehouse on the appointed date. Under such circumstances, that B may have reasonable opportunity of satisfying himself that the thing offered is beat of the quality contracted for, and that there are 1000 kgs. It must be for whole obligation. Example: X, a singer enters into a contract with Y, the manager of theatre, to sing at his theatres 2 nights in every week during the next 2 months, and Y engaged to pay her 10,000 rupees for each night's performance. On the sixth night, X willfully absents herself from the theatre. Y is at liberty to put an end to contract. Y is at liberty to put an end to the contract. Example: A promises to deliver 100 bales of cotton on a certain date on the agreed day and place. A offers to deliver A offers to deliver 100 bales only. This is not a valid tender. This is not a valid tender. This is not a valid tender. By whom a contract may be performed. Section 40, 41 and 42. By whom a contract may be performed. Section 40, 41 and 42. The promise under a contract may be performed has the circumstances may permit by the promiser himself or by his agent or his legal representative. Promiser himself: if there is something in the contract to show that it was the intention of the parties that the promise should be performed by the promiser himself, such a promise must be performed by the promiser. This means contracts which involve the exercise of personal skill or diligence, or which are founded on personal confidence between the parties, must be performed by the promiser himself. Example: A promises to paint a picture for B, and these must be performed by the promiser himself. Agent: where personal consideration is not the foundation of a contract, the promiser or his representative may employ a competent person to perform it. Legal representatives: a contract which involves the use of personal skill or is founded on personal consideration comes to an end on the death of the promiser. As regards any other contract, the legal representatives of the deceased promiser are bound to perform it unless a contrary intention appears from the contract. Section 37 Paragraph 2. But their liability under a contract is limited to the value of the property they inherit they inherit from the deceased. Example: A promises to B to pay 1 lakh rupees on delivery of certain goods. A may perform this promise either himself or causing someone else to pay the money to B. If A dies before the time appointed for payment, his representative must pay the money or employ some other person to pay the money. If B dies before the time appointed for the delivery of goods, these representatives shall be bound to deliver the goods to A, and A is bound to pay 1 lakh rupees to B's representative. Example: A promises to paint a picture for B for a certain price. A is bound to perform the promise himself. He cannot ask some other painter to paint the picture on his behalf. If A dies before painting the picture, the contract cannot be enforced either by A's representative or by B. Third party, third person, third person's effect of accepting performance from third person. Section 41. When a promisee accepts performance of the promise from a third person, he cannot afterwards enforce it against the promiser. That is performed by a stranger if accepted by the promisee. This results in discharging the promiser, although the latter has neither authorized nor ratified the act of the third party. Example: A received certain goods from B, promising to pay 1 lakh rupees. Later on, A expressed his inability to make payment. C, who is known to A, pays 60,000 rupees to B on behalf of A. However, A was not aware of the payment. Now B is intending to sue A for the amount of 1 lakh rupees. Therefore, in the present instance, B can sue only for the balance amount, that is 40,000 rupees, and not for the whole amount. Joint promisor. Section 42. When two or more persons have made a joint promise, then unless a contrary intention appears by the contract, all such persons must jointly fulfill the promise. If any of them dies, his legal representatives must jointly with the surviving promisers fulfill the promise. If all the them die, the legal representatives of all of them must fulfill the promise jointly. Example: A, B and C jointly promised to pay 6 lakh rupees to D. Here A, B and C must jointly perform the promise. If A dies before performance, then his legal representatives must jointly with B and C perform the promise, and so on. And if all the three, that is A, B and C, dies before performance, before performance, then the legal representatives of all must jointly perform the promise. Distinction between succession and assignment. Distinction between two legal concepts with succession and assignment may be noted carefully. When the benefits of a contract are succeeded to by process of law, then both burden and benefits attaching to the contract may sometimes devolve on the legal heir. Suppose a son succeeds to the estate of his father after his death. He will be liable to pay the debts and liabilities of his father owned during his lifetime. But if the debts owned by his father exceed the value of estate inherited by the son, then he would not be called upon to pay the excess. In other words, the liability of the son will be limited to the extent of the property inherited by him. In the matter of an assignment, however, the benefit of a contract can only be assigned but not the liabilities thereunder. This is because when liability is assigned, a third party gets involved therein. Thus, a debtor cannot relieve himself of his liability to creditor by assigning to someone else his obligation to repay the debt. On the other hand, if a creditor assigns the benefit of a promise, he thereby entitles the assignee to release the debt from the debtor. But where the benefit is coupled with a liability or when a personal consideration has entered into the making of the contract, then the benefit cannot be assigned. Liability of joint promisor or and promisee. De- devolution devolution of joint liabilities. Section 42. If two or more persons have made a joint promise, ordi- ordinarily all of them during their lifetime must jointly fulfill the promise. After death of any one of them, his legal representative jointly with the survivor or survivors should do so. After the death of the last survivor, the legal representatives of all the original co-promisers must fulfill the promise. Example: X, Y, and Z, who had jointly borrowed money, must, during their lifetime, jointly repay the debt. Upon the death of X, his representatives representative say as along with Y and Z should jointly repay the debt and so on. If in an incident all the borrowers X, Y and Z dies, then their legal representatives must fulfill the promise and repay the borrowed amount. This rule is applicable only if the contract reveals no contrary intention. We have seen that Section 42 deals with voluntary discharge of obligations by joint promisors, but if they do not discharge their obligations on their own volition, what will happen? This is what Section 43 resolves. Any one of joint promisors may be compelled to perform Section 43 when two or more persons make a joint promise. The promisee may, in the absence of express agreement to the contrary, compel any one or more of such joint promisors to perform the whole of the promise. Each promisor may compel contribution. Each of two or more joint promisors may compel every other joint promisor to contribute equally with himself to the performance of the promise, unless a contrary intention appears from the contract. In other words, if one if one of the joint promisor is made to perform the whole contract, he can call for a contribution from others. Sharing of laws. Why default in contribution? If any one of two or more joint promisors makes default in such contribution, the remaining joint promisors must bear the loss arising from such default in equal shares. Explanation to Section 43. Nothing in this section shall prevent a surety from recovering from his principal payments made by the surety on behalf of the principal, or entitled the principal to recover anything from the surety on account of payment made by the principal. Example: A, B and C joint promise to pay to D 3 lakh rupees. D may compel either A or B or C to pay him 3 lakh rupees. Example 15. A, B and C are under a joint promise to pay D 3 lakh rupees. C is unable to pay anything. A is compelled to pay the whole. A is entitled to receive 1.5 lakh rupees from B. A is entitled to receive 1,50,000 rupees from B. Example: X, Y and Z jointly promise to pay 6,000 rupees to A. A may compel either X or Y or Z to pay the amount. If Z is compelled to pay the whole amount, X is insolvent but his assets are sufficient to pay to pay one half of his debts. Z is entitled to receive 1,000 rupees from X's estate and 2,500 rupees from Y. We thus observe that the effect of Section 43 is to make the liability in the event of a joint contract, both joint and several, in so far as the promisee may in the absence of a contract to the contrary, compel anyone or more of the joint promisors to perform the whole of the promise. Effect of release of one joint promisor. Section 44. The effect of release of one of the joint promisors is dealt with in section 44, which is stated below. Where two or more persons have made a joint promise, a release of one of such joint promises by the promisee does not discharge the other joint promiser and or joint promisers. Neither does it free the joint promisers so released from responsibility to the other joint promiser or promisers. Neither does it free the joint promisers so released from responsibility to the other joint promiser or promisers. Example: A, B and C joint promised to pay 9 lakh rupees to D. D released A from liability. In this case, the release of A does not discharge B and C from their liability. They remain liable to pay the entire amount of 9 lakh rupees to D, and thus A is not liable to pay to D, but he remains liable to pay to B and C. That is, he is liable to make the contribution to the other joint promisers. That is, he is liable to make the contribution to the other joint promisers. Rights of joint promises. The law relating to devolution of joint rights is contained in section 45, which is reproduced below. When a person has made a promise to two or more persons jointly, then unless a contrary intention appears from the contract, the right to claim performance rests has between him and them, with them during their joint lives, and after the death of any of them, with the representative of such deceased person jointly with the survivor or survivors, and after the death of the last survivor, with the representatives of all jointly, with the representatives of all jointly. Example: A, in consideration of 5 lakh rupees lent to him by B and C, promises B and C jointly to repay them that sum with interest on a specified date, but B dies. In such a case, right to demand payment shall rest with these legal representatives jointly with C during C's lifetime, and after the death of C, with the legal representatives of B and C jointly. Time and place for performance of the promise. The law on the subject is contained in section 46 to 50 explained below. Time for performance of promise. Where no application is to be made and no time is specified. Section 46. Where why the contract a promiser is to perform his promise without application by the promisee, and no time for performance is specified. The engagement must be performed within a reasonable time. Explanation to section 46. The expression reasonable time is to be interpreted having regard to the facts and circumstances of a particular case, time and place for performance of promise, where time is specified and no applicable application to be made. Section 47. When a promise is to be performed on a certain day and the promiser has undertaken to perform it without application by the promiser may perform it at any time during the usual hours of business on such day, and the place at which the promise ought out to be performed ought to be performed. Example: if the delivery of goods is offered say after 8:30 p.m., the promisee may refuse to accept delivery for the usual business hours are over. Moreover, the delivery must be made at the usual place of business. Application for performance on certain day to be at proper time and place. Section 48. When a promise is to be performed on a certain day and the promiser has not undertaken to perform it without application by the promisee, it is the duty of the promisee to apply for performance at a proper place and within the usual hours of business. Explanation to section 48 states that the question what is a proper time and place is in each particular case a question of fact. Place for the performance of promise where no application to be made and no place fixed for performance. Section 49. When a promise is to be performed without application by the promisee and no place is fixed for the performance of it, it is the duty of the promiser to apply to the promisee to appoint a reasonable place for the performance of the promise and to perform it at such a place. Example 20. A undertakes to deliver mounts a thousand mounts of jute to be on a fixed day. A must apply to B to appoint a reasonable place for the purpose of receiving it and must deliver to it to him at such place. Performance in manner or at time prescribed or sanctioned by promisee. Section 50. The performance of any promise may be made in any such manner or at any time which the promisee prescribes or sanctions. Performance of reciprocal promise. The law on the subject is contained in section 51 to 58. The provisions thereof are summarized below. promiser not bound to perform unless reciprocal promisee ready to willing to perform Section 51. When a contract consists of reciprocal promises to be simultaneously simultaneously performed, no promiser needs to perform his promise unless the promisee is ready and willing to perform his reciprocal promise. Example: A and B contract that A shall deliver the goods to B to be paid by B on delivery. A need not deliver the goods. A need not deliver the goods unless B is ready and willing to pay for the goods on delivery. Order of performance of reciprocal promises. Section 52. When the order of performance of the reciprocal promises is expressly fixed by the contract, they shall be performed in that order, and where the order is not expressly fixed by the contract, they shall be performed in that order which the nature of the transaction requires. When the order of performance of the reciprocal promises is expressly fixed by the contract, they shall be performed in that order, and where the order is not expressly fixed by the contract, they shall be performed in that order which the nature of the transaction requires. Example: A and B contract that A shall build a house for B at a fixed price. Is promised to build the house must be performed before B's promise to pay for it. Liability of party: preventing event on which the contract is to be take effect. Section 53. Liability of party: preventing event on which the contract is to be take effect. Section 53. When a contract contains reciprocal promises and one party to the contract prevents the other from performing his promise, the contract becomes voidable at the option of the party so prevented, and he is entitled to compensation from the other party for any loss he may sustain in consequence of the non-performance of the contract. Example: A and B contract that B shall execute some work for ₹1,000. B is ready and willing to execute the work accordingly, but A prevents him from doing so. The contract is voidable at the option of B, and if he elects to rescind it, he is entitled to recover from a compensation for any loss which he has incurred by its non-performance. Example: in a contract for the sale of standing timber, the seller is to be cut and cord it whereupon buyer is to take it away and pay for it. The seller quotes only a part of the timber and neglects to quote the rest. In that event, the buyer may avoid the contract and claim compensation from the seller for any loss which he may have sustained for the non-performance of contract. Effect of default has to that promise which should be first performance contract consisting of reciprocal promises. Section 54. Section 54 applies when the promises are reciprocal and dependent. If the promiser who has to perform his promise before the performance of the other's promise fails to perform it, he cannot claim performance of the other's promise, and is also liable for compensation for his non-performance. Example: A hires B's ship to take in and convey from Kolkata to Mauritius, Mauritius to the Mauritius, a cargo to be provided by A. B receiving a certain freight for its convenience. A does not provide any cargo for the ship. A cannot claim the performance of B's promise and must make compensation to B for the loss which B sustains by the non-performance of the contract. Example: A hires B to make a shoe rack. A will supply the plywood, Fevicol and other items required for making the shoe rack. B arrived on the appointed day and time, but A could not arrange for the required materials. A cannot claim the performance of B's promise and must make compensation to B for the loss which B sustains by the non-performance of the contract. Effects of failure to perform at the time fixed in a contract in which time is essential. Section 55. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya.